The date was December 22nd, 1943. Over the frozen skies. Above Bremen, Germany, a B-17 Flying Fortress named Snap, Crackle, Pop, was dying. Flak had torn through its fuselage like a fist through paper. 2 engines trailed. Black smoke. The formation around it pressed on, as formations always did, because formations had to. Inside the shuddering aircraft, 22-year-old staff. Sergeant Alan McGee, a turret gunner from Plainfield, New Jersey, already knew the mathematics of survival were not in his favor. At 22,000 feet, the air was thin as a rumor and cold enough to kill a man before the ground ever could. And then the aircraft broke apart. If you have ever stood on the edge of something impossibly high and felt that lurch in your stomach, that primal recoil of every nerve in your body, multiply that by 22,000 feet. Multiply it by the screaming wind and the smell of burning oil and the sound of metal tearing, and you begin to approach what Alan McGee experienced in the final seconds before he was thrown from the aircraft without a parachute. He was not supposed to survive. No one without a parachute, falling from that altitude, over 4 miles of open German sky, ever survived. The mathematics, the physics, the entirety of human experience all agreed on this point with quiet certainty. And yet, if you are new here, welcome. This channel is dedicated to the stories history almost forgot, told with the honesty they deserve. Hit subscribe so you never miss one. What happened to Alan McGee in the skies over Bremen on that December morning was not a miracle in the cheap, casual sense of the word. It was the collision of physics, luck, engineering, human endurance, and a set of circumstances so precisely and improbably arranged that it would take investigators, doctors, and historians years to fully understand how a man could fall for miles through open air and walk, or rather, be carried away from it. This is the story of that fall. But more than that, it is the story of what the fall revealed, about the men who flew the bombers, about the doctrine that sent them up in formations to die, about what the human body can survive when everything suggests it cannot, and about the brutal, grinding arithmetic of the daylight bombing campaign over occupied Europe, a campaign that consumed young men by the thousands and asked, in return, that they believe it was working. To understand what Alan McGee fell into that morning, you have to understand what he had flown up into in the first place. By the autumn of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had committed itself with absolute conviction to a doctrine known as daylight precision bombing. The idea was seductive in its clarity. Send heavily armed formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses over German industrial targets in broad daylight, drop bombs with surgical precision using the celebrated Norden bombsight, and systematically dismantle the enemy's capacity to wage war. It was a strategy built in classrooms and war games at Maxwell Field, Alabama, refined at the Air Corps Tactical School through the 1930s by men who believed, with the fervor of converts, that the bomber would always get through. The British had already learned otherwise. By 1941, the Royal Air Force had largely abandoned daylight bombing over Germany after suffering losses that threatened to shatter entire commands. They had retreated to the cover of darkness, accepting that precision was impossible at night but that survival, at least, was marginally more achievable. The Americans watched this and drew a different conclusion. Their bombers were faster. Their defensive armament was heavier. Their formations, flying tight, mutually supporting boxes called combat boxes, would create overlapping fields of fire that no German fighter could penetrate without paying an unbearable price. They were, they believed, beyond the lessons the British had been forced to learn. The B-17 itself seemed to justify that confidence. It was a formidable machine, with a wingspan of 103 feet and a loaded weight approaching 65,000 pounds. It was one of the largest aircraft the world had yet produced. Its airframe was built around a philosophy of redundancy. 4. Right cyclone engines meant that two could fail and the aircraft might still limp home. Its self-sealing fuel tanks resisted puncture. Its aluminum skin, though thin enough to be punched through with a fist, was arranged in a semi-monocoque structure that distributed stress across the whole frame rather than concentrating it in any single point. And it was armed, bristling with 1350 caliber machine guns, mounted in chin turrets, ball turrets, waist positions, dorsal turrets, tail positions, and cheek mounts, positions that together gave the aircraft overlapping arcs of fire covering virtually every angle of approach. The men who flew and fought inside it were no less carefully selected. Gunners like Alan McGee went through weeks of gunnery school, learning to lead targets, compensate for wind and airspeed, maintain their weapons in temperatures that dropped to 50 degrees below zero at altitude. They were young, most of them 19, 20, 22 years old, drawn from farms in Ohio and cities in New Jersey and small towns across the American South and Midwest. Many had never flown in an aircraft before enlisting. Within months they were expected to sit inside a plexiglass sphere, the size of a large beach ball, suspended beneath the belly of a bomber flying at 4 miles altitude over defended German territory, and operate a weapon system with calm professionalism while fighters attacked from every direction. Alan McGee had grown up in Plainfield, New Jersey, the son of working-class parents, with no particular destiny marked out for him before the war arrived and rearranged everyone's destinies. He was quiet, by most accounts, the kind of man whose courage expressed itself not in speeches or bravado but in the simple, unremarkable act of doing what needed to be done. He had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, gone through the standard pipeline of training, and been assigned to the 303rd Bombardment Group, based at Molesworth in Cambridgeshire, England. His aircraft, the B-17F designated Snap, Crackle, Pop, was one of hundreds flying missions over occupied Europe through the autumn and winter of 1943. Those missions were taking a toll that the doctrine had not fully anticipated. The Schweinfurt raids of that October had destroyed 60 B-17s in a single day. 60 aircraft, 600 men, gone in the span of one afternoon's fighting. The losses were not sustainable. Every mission that went deep into Germany without fighter escort was a statistical lottery, and the men flying knew it. They flew 10 missions, 20, 25, counting toward the magic number of 25 that would theoretically rotate them home. Many never came close. The average bomber crew member in the 8th Air Force during this period faced a probability of being killed or captured before completing a full tour that some analysts placed above 50%. These were not abstract numbers to the men in the barracks at Molesworth. They were the empty bunks, the personal effects quietly gathered by squadron clerks, the names added week by week to lists that grew longer as winter set in. By December of 1943, the mission to Bremen was not unusual in its ambition or its danger. Bremen was a port city and industrial center in northwestern Germany, home to shipyards, submarine construction facilities, and aircraft manufacturing. It had been hit before and would be hit again. The Luftwaffe defended it vigorously. Flak batteries ringed the city with a density that turned the sky above it into something that veterans described, with characteristic understatement, as busy. On December 22nd, the weather over England was poor. It was almost always poor that winter, but the forecast over the target was acceptable, and acceptable was enough. The mission went forward. Snap, Crackle, Pop lifted off from Molesworth that morning carrying its crew of 10, its bomb load, and the accumulated weight of a doctrine that asked young men to fly into the most heavily defended airspace in the world and trust that their formation and their guns would see them through. Alan McGee took his position in the top turret, a hydraulically operated sphere mounted above and just behind the cockpit, from which he could rotate through 360 degrees and engage fighters approaching from above. The turret was cramped, cold, and exposed. It was also one of the more critical defensive positions on the aircraft. From up there, McGee would have had a view of the formation around him, the contrails, stretching across the sky like white scratches on blue glass, the other fortresses, holding their positions with the painstaking precision that the doctrine demanded. The formation crossed the North Sea and entered German airspace. Flak began rising. Toward them, the black blossoms of exploding shells that crews learned to read like weather, heavy, medium, light, accurate, barrage pattern, tracking. Over Bremen, it was heavy and accurate. Shells detonated among the formation, and one of them found. Snap, crackle, pop, with the indifferent precision of physics and shrapnel. Exactly what happened in those seconds is not recorded with the clarity that historians prefer. What is known is that the aircraft was catastrophically damaged. 2 engines failed. Control surfaces were compromised. The aircraft began to fall out of formation, and falling out of formation over a defended target in a damaged aircraft was, in the calculus of that war, very nearly a death sentence. What happened next to Alan McGee would be reconstructed afterward from physical evidence, medical records, the testimony of German witnesses, and McGee's own account, an account given in the careful, understated language of a man who had processed something almost too large for ordinary words. At some point in the disintegration of the aircraft, McGee was thrown clear. Whether the aircraft broke up around him or whether he was ejected through some combination of explosive decompression and structural failure is uncertain. What is certain is that he left the aircraft without a functioning parachute at an altitude of approximately 22,000 feet, roughly 4 1/5 miles above the surface of the Earth. He was, by every available measure, a dead man. The physics of a fall from that altitude are not complicated to understand in principle, though they are extraordinary in their reality. A human body in freefall accelerates under gravity at 32 feet per second squared until it reaches terminal velocity, the point at which air resistance exactly counterbalances the force of gravity. For a human body in a typical spread-eagle position, terminal velocity is approximately 120 miles per hour, reached after roughly 12 seconds of freefall. From 22,000 feet, assuming terminal velocity is reached quickly and maintained, the time of fall is somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 minutes. In those 90 seconds to 2 minutes, the falling person passes through several distinct environments. At 22,000 feet, the air temperature is well below zero. In December over Germany, it could reach minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. The air at that altitude is thin enough that consciousness without supplemental oxygen is not sustainable for long. A person ejected into that environment without preparation is simultaneously freezing, asphyxiating, and falling at a speed that will deliver, upon contact with any solid surface, a kinetic energy roughly equivalent to being struck by a large vehicle at highway speed. McGee was unconscious or semi-conscious for much of the fall. He had been wounded. Before leaving the aircraft, he would be found with multiple injuries consistent with flak and aircraft debris, and the oxygen deprivation at altitude would have dimmed whatever awareness remained. This was, in a grim way, merciful. He did not experience those 90 seconds as 90 seconds of conscious terror. He experienced them, to whatever extent he experienced them at all, as fragments, cold, darkness, wind, the distant sound of his own falling. What he fell into, on the other side of those 90 seconds, was the glass roof of the St. Lazare railway station in Bremen. The station's vaulted glass and steel roof, a structure of the kind common to European railway architecture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was not designed to arrest the fall of a human body, but it did not need to function as a net to save a life. It needed only to absorb and distribute the kinetic energy of impact across a surface area large enough, and with enough sequential give, to reduce the deceleration forces on McGee's body from instantly lethal to merely catastrophic. Glass, when it shatters, does not stop a falling body, it slows it, briefly, through the work of breaking. And a vaulted structure, with its lead panes and supporting metalwork, provides a series of successive resistances rather than a single solid stop. The physics here are unforgiving in their precision. What saved Alan McGee was not luck in the simple sense, but the accidental alignment of a specific roof geometry, a specific angle of impact, and a body that, for reasons medical science still does not entirely explain, absorbed what followed and refused to stop. He was found by German soldiers and civilians in the wreckage of the roof, bleeding heavily, with a shattered shoulder, multiple broken bones, wounds across his body, and 9 of his fingers damaged severely enough to require surgical attention. He was, by any clinical assessment, gravely injured. He was also, impossibly, alive. German medical personnel treated him at the scene and transported him to a military hospital. The German doctors who examined him were reportedly astonished, not simply at his survival, which seemed to defy their professional experience, but at the specific pattern of his injuries, which told the story of the fall with anatomical precision. His body had absorbed the impact in ways that suggested the roof had done its terrible work, breaking his fall in stages rather than all at once. His wounds were severe but survivable. His bones had fractured in patterns consistent with distributed rather than concentrated impact. He had, in the most literal sense, been broken carefully enough to live. The men who flew the missions understood the odds in ways that the architects of doctrine, working in offices in Washington and High Wycombe, did not always fully reckon with. They understood them not as statistics but as experience, as the specific weight of an empty bunk, the specific silence of a crew position that had held a man yesterday and held no one today. By the winter of 1943, that understanding had settled into the bones of every man flying out of the English bases like the cold itself, persistent and inescapable. There is a particular psychology that develops in men who face mortal danger, repeatedly and routinely. It is not the psychology of heroism as it tends to be depicted, chest forward, chloride, unafraid. It is something quieter and more complicated, a compartmentalization so deep it becomes structural, a learned ability to perform the ordinary rituals of daily life, eating breakfast, cleaning equipment, writing letters home, while holding at a careful distance the knowledge of what the morning might bring. Veterans of the 8th Air Force described it in various ways. Some spoke of not thinking about it. Others described a kind of fatalism that was not despair but its own form of peace, an acceptance that the outcome was partially outside their control, and that worrying about it consumed energy they needed for other things. Alan McGee, by the accounts available, was that kind of man. He had flown his missions. He had done his job. On December 22, 1943, he had climbed into his turret as he had climbed into it on every previous mission. Done what the morning required, and then the morning had done something to him that no amount of training or psychological preparation could have anticipated. When German soldiers pulled him from the rubble of the St. Lazare station roof, they were confronted with a problem that had no obvious precedent. Here was an enemy airman, a prisoner of war under the terms of the Geneva Convention, who was simultaneously gravely wounded and alive in a manner that appeared close to inexplicable. The accounts of his discovery vary in their specifics. The compressed transmission of wartime records leaves gaps, but the essential fact is consistent. Across sources, McGee was found in a state that should not have been survivable, and the Germans who found him knew it. He was taken initially to a German military field hospital in the Bremen area, where surgeons worked to address the most urgent of his injuries. His right shoulder had been severely damaged. Some accounts describe it as shattered, though the precise orthopedic terminology varies between sources. He had fractures in multiple locations. The wounds from flak or aircraft debris, sustained before or during the fall itself, complicated the picture further. 9 of his fingers required surgical intervention. The cold at altitude, combined with the physical trauma of the impact, had damaged them extensively. He was a catalogue of injuries, each one individually serious, collectively extraordinary in what they implied about the forces his body had absorbed. If you have stayed with this story so far, consider sharing it with someone who loves history, and if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Stories like this one deserve a wider audience. The German surgeons who treated him were professionals operating under wartime conditions, which is to say they were skilled, overworked, and accustomed to treating catastrophic trauma. They were not, however, accustomed to treating men who had fallen 4 miles without a parachute and required treatment rather than documentation. The medical literature on falls from extreme altitude was sparse in 1943, for the obvious reason that such falls were almost universally fatal. The doctors who worked on McGee were in some sense working without a map. What they found, and what would later be examined more carefully by Allied medical personnel after the war, was that McGee's survival appeared to rest on several intersecting factors, none of them sufficient alone. The glass roof of the station had provided a sequential deceleration, not a single impact, but a series of progressively resistive collisions as he broke through successive layers of the structure. This sequential quality was critical. The human body can survive very high deceleration forces if those forces are distributed across time. This is the principle behind crumple zones in automobiles and the graduated resistance of modern safety systems. What kills in a fall is not the speed itself but the instantaneous stop, the moment when velocity becomes zero in a fraction of a second and the body's organs, still moving at the original velocity, collide with the structures trying to contain them. The St. Lazare roof had not stopped McGee instantly. It had slowed him, in stages, enough. But the roof alone does not fully explain the outcome. McGee's unconsciousness or semi-consciousness during the fall may have been protective in ways that seem counterintuitive. A conscious person falling from that altitude tends, involuntarily, to tense the body in anticipation of impact, a muscular bracing that, paradoxically, can increase injury severity by transmitting force more rigidly through the skeletal and muscular system. An unconscious or deeply relaxed body absorbs impact differently, distributing stress through soft tissue and allowing the skeleton to flex rather than resist. Military physicians studying survival cases from extreme falls, a small but not entirely empty literature that would accumulate through the war and afterward, noted this pattern in several documented instances. The body that does not fight the fall sometimes survives the fall more intact than the body that does. There was also the matter of McGee's physical condition. He was 22 years old, in the peak physical condition that the Army Air Forces required of its aircrew. With the bone density, muscular development, and cardiovascular resilience of a young man at the height of his physical powers. None of this made him immune to the forces involved, but it may have placed him at the furthest possible edge of what the human body, at its most capable, could absorb. He was transferred, once stabilized, to a prisoner of war facility within the Luftwaffe-administered camp system, the Stalag Luft network that housed Allied airmen captured over German-controlled territory. The conditions in these camps for Western Allied prisoners, while far from comfortable, were generally consistent with the requirements of the Geneva Convention, Red Cross food parcels, basic medical attention, correspondence with family. McGee spent the remainder of the war recovering, in the company of other Allied airmen who had their own stories of survival and capture, in the grey institutional routines of captivity. He was liberated in the spring of 1945, when American ground forces overran the camp system as the Reich collapsed inward from every direction. He came home, received further treatment for the injuries that had not fully healed, and returned to civilian life in New Jersey. He did not speak extensively about his experience in the immediate post-war years. This was characteristic of the men who had been through the worst of it. The culture of that generation did not encourage the extended public processing of trauma. You came home. You put it away. You got on with things. But the story did not stay away. Over the decades that followed, as historians began the long work of documenting the 8th Air Force's campaigns in detail, interviewing survivors, cross-referencing operational records, examining German archives that became accessible after the war, McGee's Fall became one of the most carefully documented cases of extreme altitude survival in the historical record. The specifics were verified. The medical analysis was conducted. The physical evidence of the station roof was examined. And what emerged from that process was not a simple story of miraculous survival but something more textured and more revealing. Because Alan McGee's Fall was, in one sense, a story about an individual and his extraordinary luck. But in another sense, the sense that history tends to find most instructive, it was a story about the system that put him in that turret at 22,000 feet over Bremen on a December morning, and what that system cost, and what it achieved. The daylight precision bombing campaign of the 8th Air Force in 1943 was, by almost any measure, among the most costly military undertakings in American history. The losses at Schweinfurt in October of that year, 60 aircraft and 600 men in a single mission, repeated twice within a week, had forced even the most committed advocates of the doctrine to acknowledge that unescorted deep penetration raids were not sustainable. The doctrine had been built on a faith in defensive armament that the reality of German fighter tactics had not supported. The Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109, in the hands of experienced Luftwaffe pilots, had found ways to attack the formations that negated much of the overlapping fire the doctrine had relied upon. Head-on attacks, coming in at high speed from 12 o'clock level, gave the bomber's gunners minimal tracking time and approached from an angle where the nose armament was weakest. The German pilots had adapted. The doctrine had not yet caught up. The solution, when it came, arrived from a direction the pre-war planners had not anticipated, not from improvements to the bombers themselves, but from a change in the fighters that accompanied them. The P-51 Mustang, fitted with drop tanks that extended its range deep into Germany and beyond, began arriving in the European theater in numbers through late 1943 and into 1944. The Mustang could escort the bombers all the way to the target and back, engaging the Luftwaffe interceptors before they could reach the formations. This transformation, not a change in the bombers but a change in what flew beside them, altered the strategic calculus of the campaign fundamentally. The losses dropped. The missions continued. The targets were struck with increasing effectiveness. But that transformation came too late for many of the men who had flown the earlier missions. For the men of 1943, the men who had gone to Schweinfurt without escort, who had flown over Bremen and Wilhelmshaven and Regensburg in the tight formations that doctrine demanded, the war had been a different thing. It had been a war of extreme attrition, of statistical courage, of asking young men to accept odds that the institutions sending them had not always been fully honest about. The 8th Air Force's total personnel killed in the European theater across the course of the war reached approximately 26,000. Within that number are embedded thousands of individual stories, stories of falls arrested and falls not arrested, of aircraft that made it home and aircraft that did not, of men who survived extraordinary things and men who did not survive ordinary ones. McGee's story sits within that larger accounting, not apart from it. What makes his case enduringly instructive is not simply its improbability, though. The improbability is genuine and documented, but the questions it opens about the boundary between what is survivable and what is not, about the relationship between individual chance and institutional decision, about the way that extreme circumstances reveal the limits and capacities of the human body and the human will. The doctors who studied survival cases from extreme falls, during the war and in the decades afterward, developed a more nuanced understanding of what the body could tolerate than the pre-war literature had suggested. Aviation medicine, as a discipline, was in its early stages in 1943. The systematic study of what happened to airmen in bailouts, crash landings, and unprepared departures from aircraft was being conducted in real time, on real people, under operational conditions. McGee's case contributed to that body of knowledge, as did other documented instances that added to the emerging understanding of human tolerances at altitude and at impact. He was awarded the Air Medal for his service. He returned to New Jersey. He lived the rest of his life in a manner that did not, from the outside, announce itself as the life of a man who had fallen 4 miles without a parachute. He worked. He raised a family. He grew old in the ordinary, hard-won way that the men of his generation grew old, carrying what they carried without making too much of it. He died in 1993, 50 years after the fall, in New Jersey. He was 72 years old. The obituaries that appeared at the time noted the fall in the same matter-of-fact terms with which he had apparently always discussed it, as something that had happened, an extraordinary intersection of chance and physics that had produced an outcome nobody expected, including himself. The railway station in Bremen where he landed, the city's main Hauptbahnhof, was rebuilt after the war, as German cities rebuilt themselves with the systematic determination that distinguished post-war European reconstruction. The glass roof, through which he fell, was repaired and eventually replaced. The city grew back around it. Today, trains pass through Bremen on schedules as regular and unremarkable as any in Europe, through a station that bears no obvious marker of what happened inside it. On December 22, 1943. But the event happened. The fall was real. The physics were real. The young man from New Jersey who had climbed into a bomber turret that morning and been thrown from the sky 4 miles above the earth was real, and his survival was real, and the broken fingers and shattered shoulder and fractured bones that documented that survival were real, and the German doctors who treated him and wrote, in their clinical reports, of a case they had no precedent for were real. And the 26,000 others, the ones who fell and did not have a railway station roof beneath them, the ones who did not return to New Jersey or Ohio or Texas, or anywhere else, they were real too. They are the context within which McGee's story must be understood, not as a counterpoint to it but as its true setting. He survived, improbably, in a campaign that killed thousands who were no less brave, no less capable, and no less deserving of survival than he was. The difference between his outcome and theirs was not virtue or skill or the favor of destiny. It was the configuration of variables on a single December morning over a German city, the angle of a body falling through glass, the age of a man's bones, the specific geometry of a vaulted railway roof. In war, that is often the whole of it. Not destiny, not justice, just the variables, falling as they fall, arranging themselves into outcomes that no one chose and no one fully understands, leaving the living to carry what the dead no longer can. The doctrine that sent Alan McGee into that sky on December 22, 1943 believed in its own mathematics with the unwavering confidence of men who had not yet been asked to test those mathematics at 22,000 feet above a defended German city. The doctrine believed in overlapping fields of fire, in the invincibility of the tight formation, in the ability of precision and altitude to reduce the violence of war to something approaching a manageable engineering problem. Those beliefs were not without foundation. But they were also not without cost. And the cost was not paid by the men who held the beliefs. It was paid by the men in the turrets. Alan McGee had not been given a choice about any of it. He had been given a turret, and a target and a formation and the accumulated faith of a military institution that believed, with the fervor that institutions tend to bring to their beliefs, that the doctrine would hold and the mathematics would work out. Sometimes they did. On December 22, 1943, over Bremen, they did not. And in the gap between what the doctrine promised and what the morning delivered, Alan McGee fell, and fell, and fell. And then, against everything, he did not die. That fact does not redeem the campaign that sent him there. It does not balance the accounting of the 26,000. It does not resolve the gap between the world that doctrine imagines and the world that young men find when they climb into bombers at dawn and point their aircraft east toward defended targets. What it does, perhaps, is something smaller and more durable. It reminds us that the boundary between what is possible and what is not is drawn in less permanent ink than we tend to assume. That the physical world, at its most extreme, still holds within it room for outcomes that defy expectation. And that sometimes, rarely, improbably, in the precise alignment of variables that nobody planned and nobody predicted, a man can fall 4 miles from the sky and land, broken but breathing, in the wreckage of a world that tried and failed to kill him. The morning of December 22, 1943 began for Alan McGee in a turret at 22,000 feet, with the formation around him and the target ahead and the doctrine beneath him holding him up, as doctrines do, until they don't. It ended in the rubble of a German railway station, with German hands lifting him from the wreckage and German voices speaking urgently over his broken body. Between those two moments was 4 miles of open sky and 90 seconds that rewrote, for everyone who examined them afterward, the understood boundary of what a human being could survive. He had not chosen to fall. He had not chosen to live. He had simply been present, at a specific altitude, above a specific city, at a specific moment, and the variables had arranged themselves, for once, on the side of survival rather than against it. That is the story, not of a Superman, not of divine favor, but of an ordinary young man from New Jersey, placed by the machinery of history into extraordinary circumstances, who fell the full distance and arrived, improbably, at the other side. Some stories endure not because they are comfortable but because they are true, and because the truths they carry are too important to set aside. This is one of them. The sky over Bremen on December 22, 1943 was full of men doing the same job Alan McGee was doing, facing the same flak, flying in the same formation, trusting the same doctrine. Most of them made it back that day. Some did not. McGee fell further than any of them and returned anyway, not by design, not by right, but by the collision of chance and physics in a configuration that happens, in a life or a war, perhaps once. That is worth remembering. Not as a comfort, exactly, but as a fact, one of the stranger and more human facts that the Second World War left behind in its long wake of documentation and testimony and the stories of men who were there and came home, and carried it quietly for the rest of their lives. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below with the name of another forgotten World War II figure you want covered next, and if you have not already subscribed, now is the time.